Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Romali here at the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion for May 23rd, 2020, recorded around 12:20 p.m. Eastern Time. Well, taking a look at the latest sea surface temperature anomalies, this was updated as of yesterday. We do notice that a couple of interesting things are happening across the world of the tropics. In the Nino 3.4 regions, this area continues to be on a very significant decline. Over the last several days, we've seen or several weeks really, we've seen a continually declining sea surface temperature anomaly pattern. The actual sea surface temperatures are beginning to cool down as a result of a very strong easterly wind burst, which is winds that promote upwelling across this area. Favorite upwelling that really limits the potential for any warmer waters to actually rise to the surface and become prominent. This is likely setting up for what will likely be a potential La Nina environment by the time we end up getting to the winter of this year, of winter 2020 and 2021. We will likely see this transitioning into at least a weak La Nina, if not a moderate one, by the time this year ends. And this is likely to promote a fairly busy Atlantic hurricane season this year. And speaking of the Atlantic Basin, we have a weird AMO configuration, which is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. Basically, the way that the sea surface temperatures are oriented. We're more in a phase 1/2 configuration right now. A phase 2 typically suggests warmer sea surface temperatures in the subtropics, while a phase 1 suggests a warmer Atlantic main development region. And we're kind of in a transitional mode between both, because the Atlantic main development region is pretty decently warm, about a half degree to a degree Celsius above the long-term average at this point. And you can see here, if we just back this out real quick, these numbers are getting pretty decently up there in the half degree to 1/2 degree Celsius mark. So that's certainly one thing to kind of keep in mind, that we are in a little bit of a transitional mode, because you can see the subtropical axis here is actually warmer, and so is the Atlantic main development region, especially when you talk about in terms of just south of the Cabo Verde Islands. This area down through here is fairly decently warm, with temperatures that are probably running on the order of about 1 to 1/2 degrees Celsius above the long-term average, with areas also in the subtropical Atlantic running fairly decently above the long-term average, and even the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean is also running above the long-term average as well. If you take a look, this is from tropicaltidbits.com. This is the CDAS way of measuring. There's different measurements of the way we take sea surface temperatures and everything like that. So this is just a different methodology here for figuring out the sea surface temperature anomalies. This is taking a look at the Nino 3.4 region, which is again roughly this area right in through here of the tropical Pacific. And you do notice that really since about mid-April, we've been on this very significant decline in the El Nino phase, heading down towards a La Nina, with today's contributor a negative minus 0.320 below the long-term average. 0.50 is where we typically start looking for El Nino or in this case La Nina thresholds. 0.5 degrees Celsius above or below is where we actually establish El Nino or La Nina. We were in a El Nino-ish environment for the last bit of March into April. Been on that gradual decline ever since now and in through late May, now coming in at minus. So we've been really in that negative trend since the beginning of May about, and should continue that trend over the next while. If we take a look here at the actual sea surface temperatures, this is also from tropicaltidbits.com. This is also the CDAS methodology, valid as 1 a.m. this morning. You do notice that, again, the Gulf Stream is becoming fairly prominent, with that tongue of about 26 to 27 degrees, all the way up almost about now Cape Hatteras, about near, just off of the Cape Hatteras, we're getting about 26 Celsius. And really now most of the, really about west of about 50 degrees, we're really starting to get into that favorability where the sea surface temperatures now across portions of the western half of the MDR are now supportive of tropical cyclones. So again, it is becoming that time. We are only now 9 days away from the Atlantic hurricane season starting. And we've already had Tropical Storm Arthur, which again, kind of came up like this and then kind of moved around here, meandered down through portions of there, the remnants, so that did actually impact portions of Bermuda. But again, for the most part now, most of the Atlantic main development region west of 50 degrees west is now supportive of tropical cyclone development, sea surface temperature-wise. And again, the eastern Pacific is lighting up down here with fairly warm temperatures, and also fairly warm temperatures in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. One thing that I do want to point the attention towards is, again, the Gulf of Mexico is always going to be warm enough in the hurricane season to support and maintain intense tropical storms and hurricanes. So it is, you just have to understand that the Gulf of Mexico is always going to be supportive of intense hurricanes in the hurricane season. The Gulf of Mexico, or at least sea surface temperature-wise, it's always supportive of those intense hurricanes. So that's one thing just to kind of keep in mind, is that we're really just right now focused on the actual temperatures in the MDR region, and eventually we'll start looking out here probably past about 10 days or so when there might be something to develop, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Taking a look here at the upper ocean heat content, this is updated as of today. And again, the higher you go up in the scale towards the more yellow and green, you're actually getting the deeper, warmer water at depth. And then towards the blues, the darker blues here, you're getting less warmer water at depth. Again, we're really starting to see, especially west of about 50 degrees here west, that is the kind of the red line there. Everywhere west of that has some upper ocean heat content, especially in the Caribbean, and now extending into portions of the Gulf of Mexico, the Lesser Antilles, Puerto Rico, the islands here, and even now kind of creeping up towards the Bahamas and southeastern Florida, just off the coast there in the Gulf Stream. This area is now getting ready to experience the blossoming of favorability over the next while or so. We do have a favorable pattern that could be setting up here to support something to develop either in the eastern Pacific or the Atlantic Basin. Again, it's still a little too hard and it's still a little too early to determine where and when, but the models are coming in on fairly good agreement that something could develop either in the eastern Pacific or the Atlantic Basin. Now, if we take a look here at the 850 millibar vorticity, this is the spin in the atmosphere about 5,000 feet off the ground. The higher you go up in this scale towards the reds and whites, the higher vorticity you're getting, the higher spin you're getting. Again, not really seeing much really right now. This is actually, believe it or not, the remnants of Tropical Storm Arthur right there. Again, those remnants drifted around Bermuda and have kind of situated itself now, again, in the southwestern Atlantic and near the Azores and down through, still connected even to the remnants of Arthur. We have this old frontal boundary that's drifting away from there. We also have a disturbance, not really a disturbance, but an area of concentrated vorticity in the eastern Pacific associated along with the intertropical convergence zone. Again, not really expecting much development out of this within the next few days. And we also have a tropical wave positioned out here in the Caribbean that we'll touch on here in just a little bit. If we take a look here at the shear maps, again, there is still a fairly respectable amount of shear even near this tropical wave. So we're not really expecting much development out of that. There's about 50 knots of shear over Florida right now. Really everywhere you go, you're just getting these westerly winds that are still blowing across the region and really just inhibiting any development. The eastern Pacific has shown a little bit more favorability, and that area of vorticity is actually sitting in a relatively light pocket of shear out here, but still not expecting much over the next 5 days to develop really with that system. And if we take a look here, what you're looking at is the Caribbean vertical shear distribution. The black lines here are the averages, and the blue lines are actually the recorded, what you're looking at here. And again, we've really seen that in the Caribbean, we saw that high vertical wind shear for some of the beginning of the month, but that vertical wind shear has generally been on a fairly significant decline. And again, the latest ones that are coming in towards the end of this month are showing right at normal to just maybe a hair above average. And same with the tropical Atlantic. We've really not seen much go on with the tropical Atlantic. Again, the shear has mainly been on a decline across the region, just peaking a little bit higher now, but really not taking a look here at too much in the way of the shear. Again, the shear is gradually expected to continue to weaken and lessen over the coming over the coming weeks and certainly months here as we transition more into a favorable pattern for the Atlantic Main development region. And it's still a little too early for the MDR to actually develop anything, but certainly in the Caribbean, Southwestern Atlantic, and Gulf of Mexico, this is typically where we turn our attention towards now for the beginning of the hurricane season. Now, if we take a look, this is coming off of the models forecasting here. This is forecasting the Madden-Julian oscillation. Again, the browns indicate more of the sinking air, and the greens indicate rising air, allowing more convection to develop. And again, you do notice that as we go through time and as we begin the month of June, we're really going to be forecasting this Madden-Julian oscillation to pass really for most of the June time frame. The models do indicate that we could be seeing a favorable pattern setting up for portions of the Atlantic and portions of the Eastern Pacific as well. And that very much coincides with the potential of a Central American gyre to set up across the region, across portions of Central America, either forecasting Tropical Cyclone Genesis, maybe potentially coming off of the Eastern Pacific side or the Atlantic side. Again, it is still a little too early, but the time and window of opportunity for things to increase are really starting to ramp up once we get into the latter part, the last couple of days of May, now and through the beginning of June. We are going to be seeing the potential for stuff to actually ramp up and maybe get some early season activity going there. Now, taking a look, this is the latest satellite image. This is coming off the NOAA site, and this is the Goes East, the Band 13. We're right now looking at a tropical wave that is actually positioned roughly through about here. And if we go to the National Hurricane Center 24-hour surface forecast, this is our tropical wave that's been analyzed here. Again, this mainly came across the MDR and is now positioned across Central America and the Eastern Caribbean. And this tropical wave is actually forecast over the next while to actually get pulled off more towards the north and enter into the Gulf of Mexico and eventually potentially bring some precipitation and enhanced rainfall to the Florida Peninsula and South Florida over the next coming days. Again, the evolution of this is ever so interesting, and it may not occur as quite forecast, but again, generally in most speaking sense, this tropical wave should lift north with little to no development in the Gulf of Mexico or Caribbean, and little to no development anywhere really. But if we take a look here at the European, this is the 0Z run off of tropicaltidbits.com. We move this forward to about the next 48 hours, and this is our tropical wave axis. You do notice that there is a little bit of cyclonic turning in the atmosphere that does support that this is a tropical wave, and there is somewhat of a trough axis located in here. And if we go over the next 72 hours, the European tries to consolidate something either as it crosses the Florida Peninsula or as it exits into the southwestern Atlantic just north of the Bahamas. Again, if you remember how Tropical Storm Arthur formed, it really kind of came around here. This is much in the same pattern, the around the corner pattern, but again, really and truly, this should not be developing into much at all. And if we go to the 12Z GFS, you do notice that even through the next 60 hours, there is a piece of vorticity, and the modeling does indicate here over the next really about 108 hours, we'll actually move it to about 120, that about nearly 4 to 6 inches of rain could fall across portions of the Florida Peninsula, with some more rainfall across South Florida, anywhere between 3 to 5 inches of rain. So there's a corridor of enhanced rainfall probabilities across portions of the Florida Peninsula Memorial Day in through Tuesday, the day after Memorial Day. There is certainly a possibility of increased heavy rainfall, maybe some gusty winds, squally conditions, but again, not really forecasting this to develop into much. Now, if we move this out here throughout the next about 5 days, you do notice what's going to be occurring across portions of the Atlantic or the Eastern Pacific in through the Atlantic Basin. You do notice that the GFS is forecasting some sort of development of the remnants of Arthur or another tropical system not associated with that, probably associated off of this front, and it just looks like it kind of develops out of nowhere. But there is the potential for a tropical or subtropical system to potentially get its bearings here in the southwestern Atlantic and in the western Atlantic. There is the possibility for something, and it would pretty much coincide with what the European model is forecasting, although the European, if we kind of move it out here throughout the next about 168 hours, and if we compare that to the GFS, again, the European is a little bit slower and more further off towards the east, while the GFS is much faster and a lot further towards the west. So it is going to be an interesting determination on which models actually pick this up. But again, this is really just a feature that we're going to be watching. Again, the National Hurricane Center hasn't said anything as of right now. So again, merely we're just watching this. And then something could be forming across portions of the Eastern Pacific. And again, a Central American gyre is likely to form across portions of Central America, and maybe could be forecasting something to develop across either the Eastern Pacific or the Atlantic Basin. Again, the Eastern Pacific is climatology favored for this time of year, but again, you can never discount the Atlantic Basin. You do notice that even in the European model, the European tries to develop some areas of concentrated vorticity out here to the end of the forecast loop at about hour 240. And again, there could be the Central American gyre that develops and is likely to develop. But again, where we get that tropical development, if any, is going to be really determinate. Climatology favors the Eastern Pacific, but it's going to just be determinant on how things actually evolve over the coming days. Again, this would be heading out towards early June. The beginning of June is when we're going to be forecasting this to develop. And again, the GFS continues to develop a Central American gyre across portions of Central America and off of Mexico in the Atlantic Basin, while the European continues to favor the Eastern Pacific. So again, there is a lot to talk about here over the next about 10 days or so, heading now into the beginning of June. Again, we are 9 days away now from the official start of the Atlantic hurricane season on June 1st of 2020. So again, very important that you guys stay tuned to the latest information. Again, make sure you have all your hurricane preparedness kits. Make sure everything's in place. If you need anything, now's the time to get it before a storm arrives, before things are taken off the shelves and stuff like that. So just a brief reminder there. I will be back with another video update likely tomorrow or on Monday. Hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon and evening, and I will see you back here either tomorrow or on Monday.